I will say, at first, sorry for my rogue English. And then let me first thank to the organizer of the conference, and in particular Bernard Stiegler. I feel honored by their invitation that has given me the opportunity to meet a lot of friends, old friends and new friends, all engaged on the same front line. The always shifting front line upon which the relationship between life and techniques is articulated. A relationship that Stiegler reads as differential and transductive by grafting the dynamic of techniques elaborated by Simondon onto the dynamic of Derrida's difference with a cascade effects whose consequences I believe we are still far to fully assess. I have to say that I owe a lot to Stiegler, especially to the volumes dedicated to techniques and time. Thanks to him, many years ago, I discovered an extraordinary author, such as André Leroy-Gourhan, and I understood how important he had been for Derrida. Above all, I owe to Stiegler an interpretation of difference that I consider decisive and that is at the center of the research I have been working on. Difference is first, for Stiegler, the structural dynamic that regulates the genesis and evolution of the life of the living. In the wake of this reading, I've been searching for a confirmation of this hypothesis throughout Derrida's oeuvre. Along this way, I came across the unpublished seminar that Derrida taught in 1975 entitled La vie, la mort, life, death. The first part of the seminar centers on biology, and in particular on the logic of life by Francois Jacob, a biologist who was awarded the Nobel Prize in '65 for his research on the role played by DNA in the transmission of genetic heredity. On my reading, not only does the seminar permit to account for Stiegler's interpretation of difference, but it also establishes a shared ground between deconstruction and biology that is full of consequences on both sides. This is the general framework of my research entitled Biodeconstruction, ironical title. Today I would like to add another piece to the described framework, hoping that it could be helpful in our discussion. Once again, I try to respond to Stiegler's solicitations, this time with respect to the notion of program. Imported from cybernetics to biology, Derrida ascribes to it a relevant role in grammatology, as Stiegler points out, precisely when he raises the question of the condition of emergency of man in general history of life. History of life are the Derrida words. Let me quote from a very dense page from Techniques and Time 1. How does grammatology pose this question? By calling man or his unity into question, and by forging the concept of difference, which is nothing else than the history of life. If grammatology thinks the graphie, and if in so doing it thinks the name of man, this is accomplished by elaborating a concept of difference that calls on the paleoanthropology of Leroy-Gourhan, and does so to the extent that Leroy-Gourhan describes, and here Bernard opened a quotation from of grammatology, the unity of man and the human adventure no longer by the sample possibility of the graphie in general, but rather as a stage or an articulation in the history of life, of what is Derrida I called difference, history of life, difference, as the history of gram. And quoting from grammatology, Bernard continues saying, while calling on the notion of program, and quoting. More recently, in discussing my work with Stiegler, he warned me from the notion of program, and more generally from the consequences of an acritical adoption of the cybernetic paradigm in biology. He reminded me of the necessity to deconstruct that notion and the underlying cybernetic paradigm. Here, today, I would like to show, through reading a few passages from the mentioned seminar, that Derrida was aware of the risks implicit in the adoption of the cybernetic paradigm, and had already developed a deconstruction of it. A deconstruction, as we will see, that is interesting but problematic, because it affirms itself against the dogma of genetic biology as it was announced by Jacob. I quote from The Logic of Life. The program does not learn from experience, end quoting. Assume that the genetic program of an individual cannot undergo direct modifications from the environment. It can only undergo contingent mutations due to dysfunctions in the copy transcription of the DNA from a generation to another. The hereditary stabilization of these mutations will depend on the mechanisms of selection that are related to the environment but take place on a temporal and dimensional scale that goes beyond the life of the individual. Evidently, the resistance of this dogma in biology could weaken the interest of Derrida's theoretical proposal. Therefore, I dedicated myself to study and try to understand if this dogma is still valid, and I found out that the most recent discoveries in the field of epigenetics have caused a large revision of that dogma, so as to speak of a true revolution with remarkable consequences also on the evolution theory. I will go back to this point later. Yet, to cut it short, according to this research, the genetic program can undergo direct modifications from the environment. Also, and this is extremely important, I think, in Bernard's perspective, from the social environment. And these transformations will be transmissible from generation to generation, so that it seems legitimate to suppose that these epigenetic mechanisms play a significant role in the selection of the genetic mutations and thus in evolution. In particular, given that in this perspective it seems legitimate to hypothesize the influence of the social environment upon the genetic program, I believe it is possible to further deepen the important question of the role of techniques in the evolution of man and in the invention of man, as says Bernard. Here I'm thinking of the very dense passage of Techniques and Time 2 entitled The Biological Synthesis When Saying is Doing, in which Stigler aims to develop the consequences of the progress in genetic surgery that, in fact, suspend the biological dogma and intervenes directly on the genetic program thanks to techniques. Stigler acknowledges the danger and at the same time the possibility of a radical transformation of our conception of the human in the relation to techniques. We could say that you was thinking pharmacologically before theorizing that. In the seminar, La Vie, la Mort, Derrida's reading of is oriented to verify an hypothesis already advanced in off-grammatology. What are the deconstructive effects, if any, provoked by grafting the theory of information onto the biological research, and in particular by the use of notions such as program and writing? Throughout the seminar, Derrida explicitly recalls the hypothesis advanced in 1967, but also the reasons that impose a precise critical vigilance and thus a verification. I quote from Derrida, quoting himself 10 years after of grammatology. 10 years ago, in Of Grammatology, a chapter close the beginning, entitled The Program, recalled that, I quote, "Today, the biologist speaks of writing and program in relation to the most elementary process of the information in the living cell," and quoting from Of Grammatology. But Derrida continues, "But this was not to reinvest in the notion of word or program the entire conceptual machine of logos and of its semantic, but to try to show that the call to a non-phonetic writing in genetics would have to imply and call for an entire deconstruction of the logocentric machine," end quoting. Therefore, the recourse to the theory of information, and in particular to notions such as program and writing, grants by itself neither the emancipation of biology from philosophy, as Jacob believes, nor the deconstructive impact of biological discourse. Conversely, these notions can easily work at the service of the logocentric machine, and thus to the metaphysical conceptuality that structures the Western philosophical tradition. In fact, Jacob ascribes to the notion of program a decisive role in the revolution that takes place in biology. According to Jacob, it is only thanks to the introduction of the theory of information in the science of life that it was possible to understand the role of DNA in the cell, and thus describe genesis and structure of the genetic heredity on finally scientific basis. In particular, for Jacob, the notion of program imposed itself in the field of biology as it permits to account for two characteristics of the living that he considers immediately evident to common sense. I quote from Jacob. "The concept of program blends two notions which are always been intuitively associated with living beings: memory and design. By memory is implied the traits of the parents which heredity brings out in the child. By design is implied the plane which controls the formation of an organism down to the last detail. Much controversy has surrounded these two themes," end quoting. Jacob alludes to the controversy about the question of the acquired characters, and in particular to the possibility that the external environment can influence and modify the genetic program of a single individual, generating mutations that will be transmitted to successive generations. For Jacob, this is a common illusion due to the ingenious, intuitive, and non-scientific use of the analogy between genetic memory and nervous memory, nervous mind, brain, or psyche. I quote from Jacob. "First, with respect to the inheritance of acquired characters, the idea that the environment can influence heredity represents a natural confusion between two kinds of memory, genetic and nervous memory. The analogy," end quoting, "the analogy is justified, but once it is used naively, it can engender a dangerous confusion that induces one to identify genetic memory, the heredity that structures the living organism from its most elementary constituents, with the nervous or cerebral one that characterizes the behavior of the individual with respect to its environment. If we attribute to genetic memory the structural traits of nervous memory, acquisition, conservation, and transmission of the data that derive from the environment, then it will appear legitimate supposing that one can intervene from outside to modify the genetic memory. That is the genetic program. According to Jacob, the introduction of the notion of program allows us to establish the correct use, that is, the effective, operative, and scientific one of the analogy between genetic memory and nervous memory, as it allows us to maintain the common characters and, at the same time, to avoid the identification of the two systems of memory that correspond to two different and specific stages of the evolution of the living. I quote Jacob. For modern biology, the special character of living beings resides in their ability to retain and transmit past experience. The two turning points in evolution, first the emergence of life, later the emergence of thought and language, each corresponds to the appearance of a mechanism of memory, that of heredity and that of the mind, cerveau in original text. There are certain analogies between the two systems. Both were selected for accumulating and transmitting past experience, and in both, the recorded information is maintained only as far as it is reproduced at each generation. However, the two systems differ with respect to their nature and to the logic of their performance. The flexibility of mental memory makes it particularly apt for the transmission of acquired characters. The rigidity of the genetic memory prevents such transmission. End quoting. Derrida draws attention to the analogy highlighted by Jacob, and more generally on the very concept of analogy evoked. Firstly, for Derrida, Jacob imports a concept of philosophical provenience, analogy, into the biological discourse by attributing to it a decisive operatory value, but without the necessary critical accuracy with regards to the consequences that such a recourse would bring about for the stability and consistency of a discourse that aims to be rigorously scientific. The notion of analogy, of Platonic matrix, is strictly solidary with the structure of hierarchized opposition that characterizes metaphysics. Intelligible, sensible, signified, sign, proper, figured, concept, metaphor, and so on. And thus works within this structure, and once adopted without any critical vigilance, cannot but confirm the whole system. I quote Derrida from the seminar. As for the analogy in question, Jacob does not ask where it leads with its implications, and with the very choice of its name. He determines that analogy as a similarity between two systems. In both cases, accumulation of a past experience, and in both cases, transmission of this experience. But it is not necessary to analyze the text to go further in the necessity and problematicity of the word analogy. Firstly, analogy is between two systems and two logics, a system of proportionality between multiple terms with variables. As nervous memory, that is the cerebral one, thought and language in traditional sense, accumulates and transmits information, so does genetic memory. This relation of relations among four terms was called by Greeks logos or analogy. Here, the analogy between the two relations, two logoi, is a relation between a memory that implies language or logos in current sense, nervous or cerebral memory corresponding to the second emergence, and a memory without language in current sense, genetic memory. An analogy between a properly called logos and an alogos. But this general analogy has been only possible when, today, we got to know a scientific knowledge that the alogos was also a logos in the largest sense, that genetic memory operated as a language, with code, message, possible translation of message, and also by means of analogies, that is, putting relations into relations, and more precisely by means of four radical elements, the four radical elements of DNA, end quoting. The relationship between genetic memory and nervous memory, once it has been submitted to the order of logos, and thus to the traditional conception of language that derives from it, and still governs the function of the key terms of the theory of information, program, code, message transmission, risks importing within the biological discourse in its decisive articulation the definition of the notion of program, the logocentric structure that characterizes the metaphysical tradition from Plato to Hegel up to Saussure and beyond, as it is demonstrated in of grammatology. In particular, the determination of sign as a simple means of the external transmission of a signified constituted by itself, that is, produced from within a certain ipsity, soul, subject, consciousness, brain, and so on, and thus autonomous and independent from the signifier in charge of its transmission. I quote Derrida from the seminar. Once accepted without questions, this analogy on what is logos, a message and a code determined on the basis of their semiotic code, it is possible to ask if it is sufficient to make the subject disappear, what Jacob calls the intention of a psyche, formula that caricatures all traditional theological providences, in order to escape what the values of message, translation, design, and import from the system of logos of traditional logocentrism. End quoting. It is in this perspective that Derrida deepens the analysis of the analogy between genetic memory and nervous memory, in order to show its precariousness and absence of rigor as the symptom of the removal of an interpretative possibility that the adoption of the analogy prevents from seeing for irreducibly structural reasons. Firstly, the analogy, as it is formulated by Jacob, according to Derrida, is misconstructed. In order to establish an analogy between two or more terms, entities or relations between entities, it is necessary that each term is constructed by itself and independently determined from the other. It is necessary that between the terms of the analogy is possible to register a qualitative and essential distinction, a difference of nature, as Jacob argues with respect to the difference between genetic memory and nervous memory. However, the first determination of the analogy proposed by Jacob is quantitative and not qualitative. The two systems of memory differ from each other because of a greater, smaller flexibility or rigidity, and not because of their nature or essence. The consequence that Derrida draws from it is very important and goes far beyond Jacob's intention. I quote Derrida: "We are no longer before two rigorously discontinuous types, but two relays of the same economy. Therefore, it is no longer an analogy between two different terms, but a similarity within the element of homogeneity." End quoting. If between genetic memory and nervous memory there is a distinction that is only economical or quantitative, then not only the analogy is ungrounded, but it is necessary to recognize that the two different articulations are within the same order. General memory understood as the system of acquisition, conservation, and transmission that structures the genesis and evolution of the life of the living, that is, difference, as the structural condition of the history of life, difference as archive writing. Hence, if they are phenomena of the same order, not only it is necessary to exclude their qualitative opposition, their difference of nature and essence, but it is also legitimate to hypothesize that between the two memories there is a relationship implied in their very determination, and thus that the two systems are not the one outside of the other, that are not determined the one independently from the other, but that there is between them an evolutionary relationship, and thus that the one, nervous memory, is a specific emergence in the course of the evolution of the living, that is structured according to the condition of the other, genetic memory. This means to hypothesize that memory as an individual psychic structure is an evolutionary product of the genetic memory of the program that regulates the logic of the living, and thus that between nature, genetic memory, nature between a lot of brackets, and culture, nervous memory, there is a continuity and not a rupture, as the analogy established by Jacob supposes. This way, I do not intend to credit a rigidly determinist biologism according to which any cultural phenomenon should be brought back to the biological evolutionary conditions that structure the life of human beings and in particular of their brains. For Derrida, between genetic memory and nervous memory, it is possible to hypothesize a differential relation, and thus an articulation of the dynamic of difference as the general condition of the life of the living and of its evolutionary history. I quote Derrida. Long quotation, but important. On my side, I will look at this as a progress, at this suppression of a limit that has often served humanist or spiritualist ideologies, or, generally speaking, the most obscurantist metaphysics. I will look at this as a progress if the question of the logos of the analogy were elucidated in a critical fashion in order to avoid that it comes back per force, just legalizing a clandestine metaphysics, what has been attached to the value of logos and analogy across tradition. To say that by means of a quite algebraic anticipation, I am a partisan of the delimitation that makes limits and oppositions explode. For instance, the two types of program in which one recognizes on one side the pure genetic and on the other side the great emergence of the nervous, from the being erected to the zoon logon ekon, and what follows from it. That thus makes that opposition explode, not so much to leave room for the homogeneous, but rather to heterogeneity and differentiality. As I was suggesting from the beginning, I would add, the functioning of the opposition has always had the effect of effacing differentiality. What interests me under the heading of the au-delà and of the pas au-delà is precisely this limit without opposition of the opposition and the difference. End quoting. From this perspective, we will continue to follow the analysis of the notion of program and the deconstruction of the analogy between genetic memory and nervous memory. Derrida takes into consideration another distinctive trait that seems to be more rigorous, as of a qualitative nature, and thus able to legitimate the opposition between the two systems of memory and the very possibility of establishing a relation of analogy. For Jacob, genetic memory and cerebral memory, nervous memory, differ in their relation to the outside. While the nervous memory is open onto the outside and is subject to its modifications, the genetic one will be impermeable to the external action. I quote Jacob. The genetic program, indeed, is made up of a combination of essentially invariant elements. By its very structure, the message of heredity does not allow the slightest concerted intervention from without. End quoting. If we look more closely, this is not the case. Affirming that genetic memory is impermeable to the action of, absolutely impermeable to the action of the environment would mean to negate the possibility of selection, which is essential to evolution. For Jacob, the two systems are not opposed because of their opening or closure to the environment. They are both open onto the outside. Their opposition concerns the relation that they entertain with the environment. The nervous memory interacts in a direct, conscious, and intentional way with deliberate aims and thus can modify its behavior, while the modification of the genetic memory is subject to the so-called mutations upon which natural selection and thus the environment intervene ex post will be of the order of contingency, accidental and deprived of a direct cause-effect relationship. I quote Jacob, that explained that better than I. Whether chemical or mechanical, all the phenomena which contribute to variation in organisms and populations occur without any reference to their effects. They are unconnected with the organism's needs to adapt. In a mutation, there are causes which modify a chemical radical, break a chromosome, invert a segment of nucleic acid. But in no case can there be correlation between the cause and the effect of the mutation. There is not the slightest connection between a particular fact and its consequences in any of these phenomena. Each individual program is the result of a cascade of contingent events. The very nature of the genetic code prevents any deliberate change in program, whether through its own action or as an effect of its environment. It prohibits any influence on the message by the products of its expression. This is the dogma. The program does not learn from experience. End quoting. For Derrida, this opposition is not rigorous, as psychoanalysis and modern structural sciences such as linguistics, semiotics, anthropology, etc. have demonstrated. It is possible to extend also to nervous memory and thus to the sphere of language, of the symbolical, and more generally of culture, what Jacob maintains as an exclusive distinctive trait of genetic memory. Also nervous memory, the individual psyche, is strongly bound to codes and programs, linguistico-semiotic, social, religious, politico-institutional, economical, and so on, with regards to which the margin of the intentional and deliberate intervention is very tight and aleatory. Sometimes the program remains far beyond the threshold of individual consciousness, and thus of its possibility of action and deliberation. Consciousness is indeed an effect rather than a cause. I quote this very strange passage in Derrida. The heterogeneity of causes and effects, the non-deliberated character of changes in program, in a word, all that places the subject before a system in a situation of unconscious effects of causality, all that produces effects of contingency between the action coming from the outside and the internal transformation of the system, all of that marks well the non-genetic program as well as the genetic one. Where does Jacob take the idea that outside of the genetic system and program, the change of program is deliberated, essentially deliberated? Where, if not in a metaphysical ideological opposition that determines the superior and symbolical programs with the humanity at the highest degree, to begin with sense, consciousness, freedom, knowledge of the limit between the inside and outside, objectivity and non-objectivity, etc. Now, if there is an acquisition of the so-called structural sciences, this is the possibility to affirm that the systems related to language, the symbolical, the cerebral memory, etc., equally have an internal functioning, with an internal regulation that escapes deliberation and consciousness and makes the effect come from the outside to be perceived as contingencies, heterogeneous forces, that is necessary to interpret, translate, assimilate within the internal code, attempting to master or succumbing to them to the point that some mutations are produced that can take on any form but always refer to a violent intrusion from the outside, forcing a general restoration. End quoting. Very interesting, I think. Therefore, Derrida seems to maintain an ultra-determinist thesis, as he seems to attribute the symbolical programs to the very rigidity of the genetic program. However, the opposite is true, as the apparently paradoxical conclusions of the argument prove. The two programs, the genetic program and the symbolical one, function on the basis of different principles of internal regulation in view of their reproduction. Yet, this rigidity does not exclude their opening onto the outside. Rather, it implies for both systems the possibility of being influenced and modified from what comes from outside, and thus the necessity of interpreting what comes from outside with respect to the exigencies of reproduction of the system. What comes from outside can simply be rejected from the program as it is interpreted as dangerous, can be assimilated, conserved, and thus also transmitted as it is interpreted as useful to the survival of the system. It can induce corrections in the mechanism in charge of the execution of the program. Ultimately, it can induce modifications of code and thus through mutations. And this works for the symbolical programs as much as for the genetic program, with effects that both systems cannot easily control, as they are relatively aleatory to the extent that they are called to interpret contingency. For Derrida, the genetico-differential relation between genetic memory and nervous memory as their common condition of emergence permits to credit a thesis full of consequences, especially for biology, insofar as it contradicts our dogmatic paradigm. The program does not learn from experience. What do you say? Perfect. As I announced, I can drink. as I announced at the beginning, Jacob's dogma is put into question today within biology itself, in particular by the most recent research in the field of epigenetics, which studies the influences of the environment upon the genetic program and its execution. This research has been producing a true revolution, so as to open up new perspective on the theory of evolution. In my view, Derrida's theory not only permits to anticipate the epigenetic perspective, but also offers a consistent speculative support to it. In particular, from the epigenetic perspective, the genetic program is no longer so rigidly deterministic. Its execution depends on the interaction between groups of genes and other biochemical elements present within the cell and also belonging to other cellular groups. The interpretation of the genetic program takes place also through these interactions. They are not simple transcriptions, as in old view, but translations that, by definition, intervene actively on the originary text, like in the case of methylation. This is a particular phenomenon in the execution of the program in the cell. Through which some genes can be activated and made executive, while others are silenced and left inactive, like cancelled. This is also important for the autoimmunity theory of apoptosis. These interactions are influenced by the environment inside and outside of the individual, even by the social environment. Therefore, the environment can intervene in the execution of the genetic program and influence genesis and development of one or more individuals for what concerns the somatic architecture as well as behavior. Above all, the modification induced by the environment upon the execution of the program can be transmitted from generation to generation, a phenomenon that is of primary interest for the theory of evolution and the comprehension of the adaptation of mutations. A comparative reading should be mobilized more in details, but here I conclude by referring to the conclusions of Richard C. Francis' very beautiful book entitled The Ultimate Mystery of Inheritance, Epigenetics, published in 2011, where it is possible to find a detailed exposition of the results achieved and the perspective opened up in the field of epigenetics. Only 2 passages to give you some. No, it's finished. No, I have two quotations, just for an idea. And then there is a metaphorical use of theater for Anais. Okay, some epigenetic alteration, this is the biologist Richard Francis. Some epigenetic alterations of gene behavior have effects that extend beyond an individual lifetime. The effects of these transgenerational epigenetic alterations may be direct or indirect. Direct transgenerational effects occur when the epigenetic mark is transmitted directly from parent to offspring through sperm or egg. This is what I call true epigenetic inheritance. True epigenetic inheritance is not common in mammals like us, but it does occur. Indirect transgenerational effects are much more common. The most direct of these transgenerational epigenetic effects is genomic imprinting. It's very interesting, this, in which the original epigenetic mark in the parent is reproduced with great fidelity in the offspring. Much more indirect are the transgenerational effects observed in maternal behavior, human maternal behavior, and stress response in the rats. Here, the epigenetic alterations that influence these behaviors are recreated through the social interactions that they both influence and are influenced by. This transgenerational effect is a positive feedback loop involving gene action and social interaction. Whether direct or indirect, these transgenerational epigenetic effects should expand our notion of inheritance, the metaphor of theater. This meta-theme concerns some of our basic intuitions about the role of genes in explaining biological processes, ranging from protein synthesis to cellular differentiation and cancer. Genes are traditionally viewed as biochemical executive that initiates and directs this process, in contradistinction to all other biochemicals within a cell, which function in a more blue-collar way. I used the metaphor of theatrical production, the play, to illustrate this view. Genes are the directors, proteins the actors, and all other biochemicals act as stagehands. From an alternative perspective, advocated here, this play is more improvisational, and genes are more like members of an ensemble cast, a cast that includes proteins and other biochemical actors. Genes' actions are as much as effect as cause during protein synthesis, and genomic activity is as much effect as cause during cellular differentiation, both normal as pathological. And thank you.